Welcome to Uncomfortable, conversations about culture and Christianity. My name is Eric, and today I'm joined by Rachel.
Hey, y'all.
And Jess.
Hello, world.
And Alex.
What's up?
Hi, Alex. That was the most anticlimactic introduction you had in a while, but what's up indeed?
I was trying to think of a scientific one on the fly, but I couldn't. So
yeah, you're just You're setting up this episode for everyone about faith and science, and I got to ask you first about your shirt. It's nice. Did you steal it from Zach Morris?
From Saved by the Bell?
Yeah, what was the reasoning behind this shirt for the science episode?
Does it look like a molecular table to you?
What happened was...
It's a prism? Yeah, tell us about that.
I just saw it in the store, and I bought it, and then I wanted to wear it.
Wait a second. Go back.
So that's it.
Go back. You were walking in the store, and you look over, and it was like... And you were like...
That's the one. It was on a mannequin.
Like
wasn't
what?
It wasn't on a mannequin. Actually,
okay.
I saw it.
Was it on the clearance rack?
It was not on the clearance rack.
The mannequin was playing hacky sack, wasn't it?
I saw it, and I was disappointed at first because it seemed that they didn't have any in my size.
So
because it caught my eye right away. And then I found it in the mediums. Someone put the extra large shirt. Now you know my size. And the medium, and I was like, it was like one of those happy moments. And that's how
you know you're supposed to buy it,
right?
Because you found that size that's yours.
That is an exciting moment. To the adult women here, Rachel and Jess,
and those not listening, just imagine Saved by the Bell.
Yeah, imagine like a '90s thing.
It's black.
Would you allow your husbands to wear this shirt if he were to find it on the mannequin playing hacky sack in the mall?
I mean, I don't control my husband's wardrobe. He still has clothes from high school that he wears, 6 years later. So I'd like him to buy a new shirt every so often.
But he doesn't need to.
No, I mean, I wouldn't care.
I have bought shirts similar to that for Ben. He doesn't, and I like to buy him a little bit tighter because he's got some muscles. So I like what he's got going on.
Yeah.
I don't know if he'd wear it though.
We're not going back to last week.
I know. Aren't we already in enough trouble
you
from our conversation last week?
Well, thank you.
Okay. But I'm curious if you would ask Megan.
Dr. Megan?
Dr. Megan.
Yeah.
Ask her when you interview her if she would let her husband wear it. I'm curious. We need more info.
Yeah.
Might be awkward.
We need to pull more people. So we've got one no and one yes, so she can break the tie.
More female perspective would be good on this situation.
Thank you.
What does your wife say?
Valid,
I mean,
you're
my
valid
wife.
too, Eric.
Thank you.
So one of the things I've learned to do is when I buy shirts like this, she wasn't with me, and I kind of hide them in my closet.
Oh boy!
Wow, this sounds like a problem.
So he has a hiding place.
No, and then I break it out. Like I wore this like a few weeks ago to preach, so that I'll break it out right before like when I'm going to preach that morning. Like she will not see it before then, and then like I just see her facial reaction to see should I wear this or not. And there have been times where I've admitted on this podcast where I rolled up the pants and people made fun of it, and so I do take her advice. And that day she was like, "It's a little much." I wore a shirt a couple weeks ago on the podcast with Carrie.
Oh, I remember.
And that was one she said I couldn't.
Yes.
So she said you cannot wear that to preach.
Yeah.
So she is my kind of.
Unless it's missions week.
Yeah, unless it's missions week or I'm meeting with, because she did. It had the same pattern. One of my siblings' weddings. They had that pattern.
This is getting really. We're going really deep.
Guys, this is
psychology of Alex's wardrobe.
Get to know Alex.
Very intense.
I would like
we need to move
explain.
on. Okay,
I'd like
Alex,
you to
keep going.
I'd like you to explain your sister's mood board for her wedding now, so we can understand.
Go to Pinterest.
All right, Alex, are you looking forward to your conversation with the scientists? Are you intimidated at all?
Yeah, I'm excited. We've been talking about having her way back when Mackenzie was on there. I think it's one of her friends. She's a doctor. What kind of science? I don't remember. I'm going to have to ask her. Physicist. Yep. Yeah, she's a medical physicist. So I'm fascinated by this. Always as a pastor, how faith and science can intersect. I've had a lot of conversations with people around this, and can they? And I know even lead minister Mark is pretty passionate about this. So it'll be a fun conversation. I'm looking forward to it, and looking forward to talking about it with you guys after.
Yeah.
Megan, hey, thank you. Thanks for being on today's podcast, Uncomfortable Podcast. You might not know this, but you have been the talk of the podcast, or at least come up in a few of our conversations from like this time we started this. Like one of our former cast members, Mackenzie, she was always like, we need to get my friend Megan on. And I almost feel guilty that it was like once she's not a resident here any longer that it took us that long. But
well, she's with us in spirit.
She is, and hopefully she's listening to this. Mackenzie, we love you. We miss you. And thanks for suggesting Megan. So, Megan, you are a person, right? So so you're part of Christ Community Church. You live in Omaha, but just to kind of get to know you a little bit, we've got 3 questions that we ask our guests. We actually couldn't remember the third, so I have a new fresh one for us today. But the first question that I have for you, and you kind of heard this, so it's kind of cheating. You've had like at least 90 seconds to think about it. But what is your biggest fear?
That's a good question. For me, I really associate fear with a loss of control. So any situation where I'm not in control, it's hard to think of a good example, but like movies where someone's in an asylum against their will terrify me. Just the thought of being strapped down, not crazy, but just stuck there is absolutely terrifying to me.
Okay. Good thing we didn't bring any straight jackets or anything for you today.
Yeah.
And second one is there anything that you've binged over COVID, or you did maybe like when COVID began? Anything you binged, whether watching or reading?
Yeah, that's a good question too. My husband and I have been watching a lot of Netflix, not super bingey, but I've been binging podcasts.
Okay.
So as soon as the pandemic started, I added a whole bunch of news podcasts, especially about the pandemic, to my queue. And now I kind of regret that because I'm overloaded on pandemic news every day, but I've kind of cooled it off a little bit in recent months.
Yeah. Have you like filtered through them and kicked a few of them out of your queue? Or?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so just the short, quick updates. And if something's too stressful, I push it toward the bottom.
Yeah. And this next question is at least mostly for our viewers, but it came from one of our castmates, Jess. She wants to know if you're married, and spoiler alert, we'll get into that a little bit later on, but she wants to know if you would let your husband wear the shirt that I'm wearing right now.
Definitely not.
Okay, thank you.
I think you make it work, but no, I probably would advise against it.
What about it would make you not allow him to wear it?
Well, part of it is for his own good. So he doesn't like wearing things that draw too much attention, and I think it's definitely an attention-catching shirt.
Yeah,
I'll say that.
Yeah, it's definitely a Saved by the Bell feeling. Did you watch Saved by the Bell?
I do like kind of the 80s, 90s vibe that it's got going on.
Thank you. Yeah. I appreciate it. Yeah, we've had a lot of these conversations with my wife and myself. Anyway, thanks. Those are just fun questions to kind of get to know you a little bit, and maybe even give hints towards where we're going a little bit. But just would love to hear a little bit more of your story. So you go to CCC, you're a part of Christ Community Church, but not native to Omaha. So what brought you to Christ Community? What brought you to Omaha?
Yeah, so I moved to Omaha in 2016, and it was mainly for the job that I have now, which is as a medical physicist at the Med Center. And so I've lived in a lot of different Midwest states. I grew up in Michigan, went to college in Indiana, grad school in Wisconsin, and then I came here. So it's been kind of an interesting journey, making my way through the Midwest. But that was the main reason that we came here, was to kind of follow that job opportunity.
Cool. Big Ten country. So that's
for
good.
Sure, yeah.
Are you like a football fan?
Not really. I guess if I had to pick, I'd pick the Badgers, just because I spent the longest time at the University of Wisconsin getting my PhD. So. Okay.
Do you feel like you have any kind of Wisconsin accent or like weird words that you carry over from your time there?
Yeah, there's definitely a few words that I've picked up from the Wisconsin way of talking, don't you know?
Yeah. So how do you say bag?
Bag.
Okay. So normal.
Yeah.
Okay. just double checking how normal or not normal you are.
Yep.
So you work at the Med Center. You said a medical physicist, and about, I don't know, when we talked first, like a month ago, I had honestly no clue what that meant. And I'm a very smart human, and if I didn't know what that meant, I'm sure most of our listeners might not know what it meant, or they're just way smarter than me. So can you just, like, what does that mean? Like, a medical physicist, what do you do? What is it?
Yeah, that's a great question. Most people who get into medical physics don't know what it is until they reach a point where they get sick of whatever they're doing and they try to find something new.
Okay.
So basically, medical physics is pretty broad. It's just the application of knowledge of physics and technology to the medical field.
Okay.
So typically that is in the form of diagnosis and treatment of disease, but there's tons of wider applications for that. So we tend to be in the hospital setting as the technical experts that help make sure that all of the diagnosis and treatment is happening in a safe and effective way. I'm a therapy physicist, which means I work in radiation oncology. So we see mostly cancer patients, some other types of patients, and we treat all of them with radiation. Radiation can be really dangerous. It's also invisible. And so we need to be able to target it really precisely to the patient's disease. And medical physicists are a key part of that. So we consult with patients, we help consult with the physicians so that they can make the best decisions, and make sure that the machines are all properly functioning. And we do a lot of computer modeling and stuff like that too. So it's a pretty broad definition, but it's got a lot of intricacies that I really love.
Yeah, so physicists are outside of the medical field too, as well, right? So what are kind of other roles that physicists, I can't even say the word play, like in society, or what other kind of jobs would they have?
Yeah, so you'll see some physicists as college professors doing research and teaching physics classes. They can have all sorts of specialties like quantum mechanics or atomic, molecular, and optical physics. My specialty is in radiation physics, obviously. And then you'll also see physicists in surprising places like industry. You might see them in national labs. NASA definitely benefits from physics expertise as well. So we're kind of everywhere.
Roller coaster people, right? Would roller coaster makers?
Oh yeah, you would definitely want to consult a physicist for that.
I thought so. So I've experienced their professionalism and some thrills. So what led you to want to get into that field? Was it something like from the time you can remember you wanted to do that, or was there a journey? How'd you get into it?
Yeah, so for me, my interest started when I was 17. So I was in high school. I was in love with math. I mean, I thought math was just the most beautiful thing that we could experience as humans, which I know is weird.
Yeah.
But I also just am really compassionate, and I love taking care of people, helping my friends with their problems. And so I thought, well, maybe I could go into healthcare, get a medical degree. And then I felt kind of sad because I thought, well, what's going to happen to my math knowledge? I'm not going to be able to take as many math classes and whatnot. So I talked to my dad, who is an administrator, he's retired now, but he was an administrator in an imaging department. And I said, Dad, I just want to do math and heal people at the same time. And I wish that was a thing.
Yeah.
And he actually knew a medical physicist, so he introduced me to them. I did some shadowing, I did some soul searching, and then when I got to college orientation, my randomly assigned roommate's dad had a daughter who's a medical physicist, so like the pieces just kind of started falling into place, and I felt like God was like, hey, Megan, I want you to do this. So it's just the perfect marriage of those two loves, math and science on one side and healing people on the other.
That's cool. And so you alluded to like feeling like God was leading you in that direction. And so I think that becomes a little bit of the crux of our conversation that a lot of people struggle with is science, someone that loves science and someone that loves God. Can you do both? Are they both compatible? And so what, I guess, as you were loving math and wanting to heal people, as you had that compassionate part of you and that love for God, how did you start to rectify or reconcile, like, I really love God and I really love science, and I'm sure you heard from people like, I don't know if they can be mutually exclusive. So how did you start to rectify, or what was your history on figuring that out?
Yeah. So I wouldn't say I ever really felt a strong tension between the two. They were two parts of myself, my faith in God and my love of science. And I was always able to kind of reconcile those two within myself. But sometimes that meant holding things loosely. So, holding the story of Genesis loosely and just admitting, I don't know all the details here. I don't know why there seems to be a difference in what Genesis is telling me versus what I learn in my high school class that talks talks about evolution. But I can hold both of those at the same time and say, I'm humble enough to know I don't know everything. And so I'm going to keep digging. And so whenever I ran into some perceived tension or possible tension, I would just keep digging. And I'd look to experts and just kind of keep asking questions. And that kind of evolved more and more in college and grad school. So in college, I was actually able to take a class where we talked about science and faith because I went to a Christian school. And we read lots of amazing books, one of which was The Language of God by Francis Collins. Francis Collins' name might sound familiar to some listeners because he's actually the director of the NIH, but he's also a Christian, and he was involved in the Human Genome Project. So in that book, he talks about his own faith, his own journey with science, and how the two come together. And he's been instrumental in the website BioLogos, which I think is also a great resource. So reading that book, taking that class was really formative for me in just bringing together, the scientific knowledge that I had with the faith and the biblical understanding that I had, and kind of understanding how those two can cohere together. And that evolved even more in grad school because I was a part of InterVarsity. And InterVarsity really emphasizes this integration of your faith with your discipline.
Yeah.
So we actually had a specific discussion group that was a science and faith integration group. So we'd meet every other week or once a month and just talk about lots of issues with science and faith. And it was a really beautiful experience.
Yeah. So 2 questions that come out of that. I'm going to probably shake my head a lot. Like I understand everything you're saying because I fake it till I make it. But NIH, what does that equal?
National Institutes of Health.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure. And then the second question, you talked about like even going back to Genesis and figuring out how do I rectify like what I'm learning in, science class and what I'm, about evolution and things like that. Would you go into like intelligent design or things like that? Like you're saying, hey, I believe that this was created by God, but maybe the timelines and how specifically the meta narrative of Genesis is speaking to us is maybe not like the timeline that every Christian overlays our 21st century. Like this is 24 hours. Is that more of what you're talking about?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. I'm just curious because we've had some of those conversations and some people are like, what? You mean you don't believe God created everything? So I wanted to clarify that. Because
I think it's important to remember, what these different things can teach us. So, what is the purpose of Genesis? It's to tell us God created us. That he's got this amazing creative power, that we're made in his image. And there's other lessons from that too. But I think it's also important to remember, like, who's the expert on Genesis? It's not me.
Yeah.
It's Bible scholars. And so there are a lot of Bible scholars who talk about, the way that Genesis is written and what its purpose is. And so you can listen to them on the biblical side and listen to the scientific experts on the science side, and then, find your way to kind of mesh the two together.
Yeah. And fascinating enough, like, actually here in Omaha, and we've done a whole entire series here at the church on Genesis, but Eric Smith, who's got his PhD literally in like the first 10 chapters of Genesis, like the people that studied Genesis and the theology behind it, how it was put together, most of them are not like studying it because they're putting science over it. They're like, no, this is a meta narrative that was written to explain just that. Like God is creator. It wasn't written to like be a science textbook.
Right.
And sometimes we want to make it a science textbook. So why is this important? Like, why are these conversations about faith and science? I think especially we can get more later into why is it important right now in 2020, but why is it important overall to like have this kind of discussion?
Yeah, so I think for myself, one of the biggest reasons that it's important is that it helps me love God with my mind. So we're supposed to love God with our whole selves. Jesus said that was the most important law, right? And we're also supposed to love our neighbors as ourselves. And so part of loving God with our whole selves is loving him with our mind and our understanding. And if we don't understand the world around us, then that love is going to be limited. I think for myself, learning more and more about his creation has opened up just a sense of awe in who he is and his creative power, in the limitless expanse of the universe and the tiniest particles within our bodies. I mean, it's just mind-blowing to me.
Yeah.
So, understanding the beauty of God's creation is married perfectly with that scientific understanding. So I think that's one aspect of why it's so important. I think it's also important for the church to stay relevant. There's some surveys out there that indicate that young people over the past decade, or maybe even more, they may shy away from the church because they have the impression that it's not a place that respects science or believes in certain scientific truths that are accepted other places.
Yeah.
And so, if we want to be the aroma of Christ and draw people in and bring them into community, I think we need to, embrace the scientific truths that are around us, recognizing that science isn't a perfect process and that, there are limitations to our knowledge. Like I said, hold things loosely, but, respecting the expertise of the scientists in our community, I think is a big part of drawing people into the church.
Yeah. So if we just want to pull back really quickly to the bare bone basics, and because I do think people, especially in faith, are like, well, they can't be compatible, and mainly it's because I think we have a false understanding of what science is. And so if you were just like defining at its most basic level, like what is science?
Yeah. It's a pretty broad question. I mean, you could get tons of definitions online. I think the important thing to remember is that science is describing disciplines that use the scientific method. And the scientific method has a very particular purpose, which is to help us observe and hypothesize about patterns that we see around us in a controlled environment, and then draw conclusions from the observations that we make. So, that process has limitations. Some scientists might not implement the right controls. Maybe their conclusions were biased from the data that they observed. And so, like I said, hold things loosely.
Yeah.
Like I'm going to keep coming back to that probably. But understanding the limitations of science and what science is and what it's meant to tell us are, I think, key pieces of respecting science and scientists when we're thinking about it in terms of our faith.
Yeah. So I guess that tension of how do we hold things loosely, and then when things are like deemed scientific fact or accurate, how do we hold it loosely and respect it at the same time?
Mm-hmm.
How do we hold it loosely that there's a process, but then also how do we trust it?
Yeah.
What's that tension? How do we do that?
So I guess I'll use the pandemic as an example. In March, scientists would say one thing about what was true about the coronavirus. And you could take them at their word and say, okay, this is 100% true. Like, I'm 100% confident that this is the case. It's not aerosolized. It's not airborne. And we don't have to wear masks. And then a month later, or I forget exactly what the timeline was, scientists are now saying something different. Well, the reason they're saying something different is our knowledge has expanded as a scientific community. And so if you expect them to have been right in March with limited knowledge, then you're going to be mad when they're telling you something different 1 to 2 months later. So you can respect the scientific expertise while recognizing that the knowledge base is changing really rapidly for something like coronavirus. Yeah,
that's good. I think that's a good real life what we're experiencing, because I do hear a lot of people like they're dumb, it's an agenda. The scientists told us that mask thing, is a big example. They said not to, and then 2 weeks later they tell us to, and it's just all about control. But it's like anything. Even Mark's talked about this in Revelation. The more you study it, the more it's on your radar, and you have time to be with it. You might have a hypothesis that's one place based on all the knowledge that you have, but then as you study it more and more, you expect to grow in that, and you have to have humility to be able to admit some of those things. And so, but a lot of times, like when we want to admit we're wrong, like we want people to accept when we admit we're wrong, and then we've done 180. But if it's science, then it's like, we freak out a little bit. So.
Yeah. And I think part of the problem too is that we don't often get the science from the scientist. Sometimes scientists can be really bad communicators,
Okay.
I'll be honest. But we're oftentimes getting science from the media. And so there's interpretation that's going on. So the media might popularize one paper, but that one paper is a tiny piece in a sea of papers. And so you're not seeing the whole scientific picture because you read one article from CNN or Fox or whatever. And so, we have to be a little bit careful of that too.
Yeah. Yep. That's good. So what would you say, is there conflict or is there tension between faith and science? And if so, what are those tension points to be aware of?
Yeah. So The short answer is, I think, no, there is no conflict between the two because, God has given us science as a way to understand and study the world around us, and to utilize his creation to take ownership over it, to love other people, and to take care of the world around us. So there may be perceived conflicts or places where we feel a tension between the two, but I would say each individually also has conflicts within themselves. I mean, if you just read the Bible cover to cover, you might have a lot of questions about some of this doesn't make any sense to me. You don't need to look at science to have that problem.
Yeah.
And so some areas where people tend to feel that tension are, like we already talked about with creation. We learn about evolution in school, and then we see this 6-day picture happening in the Bible. Well, how do we reconcile those two? And other issues like consciousness. Science has one way of describing what makes us conscious, or a scientist might even tell you what makes someone a person, but a Christian might have a very definition of what personhood is. And so I think there could be some perceived tensions there as well. There's also issues of ethics, what ought we do with the scientific power that we have? If we clone a person, is that person made in the image of God? Do they have a soul? Those are really hard questions to answer. And so I think there's lots of little rabbit holes that you could go down when it comes to science and faith. But ultimately, science is supposed to tell us about the world around us. Our faith in God is based on biblical knowledge, religious experience, and things like that. Sorry, I keep going away from the microphone.
It's okay.
And so, there's different realms of knowledge that we're looking at: biblical knowledge, revelation from God, and then scientific knowledge. And I do think that they can all cohere together, but there may be some areas that feel like they have tension or conflict in them.
And that's why we brought you on here, to answer all of those questions 100%.
Yeah, I don't think we have time for that.
Okay. I would be interested to know if a clone is made in the image of God. That'd be would be quite the rabbit hole to go down.
Definitely.
So maybe later on we'll bring you back to just have that conversation.
All right.
So how does it impact your faith? So the more you've studied science and the more deeply you've delved into it, just from loving math to really becoming a scientist and doing all the work, how has that impacted your faith?
Yeah, so I would say, like I mentioned earlier, I think doing science is a way that I love God with my mind. He's given me this gift of intelligence and hard work and study that I've been able to apply in this way, to learn more about his creation. And so I'm able to kind of use those gifts for the kingdom of God, which is really powerful. And then I think also, I mentioned earlier that sense of awe, when you study how, the physics of planetary motion and the beautiful math that you can use to kind of predict positions of planets, or how we can observe, in space, the beginnings of the universe when we look at the cosmic background radiation. I mean, that just blows my mind that we can actually look out into the universe and see the Big Bang happening. We can see God breathing life into the universe. So that sense of awe in who he is really powerful. I also think that my, work as a scientist and a medical practitioner really comes alongside my faith because I act as a healer. And so I see myself as doing the work of Jesus in a hospital setting. I mean, when Jesus came, a lot of what he did when he walked this earth was healing people. He saw brokenness and he saw disease around him. He saw isolation, and he had compassion on people. And so when I walk into a hospital and I see people who are broken and hurting, I'm able to bring them healing with this amazing, powerful knowledge of radiation and how it interacts in the human body. And I feel like I'm the hands and feet of Jesus in that setting.
Yeah. So a couple of questions out of that. I don't know, that might get, as I've had conversations around this and people that are maybe super conservative or find a lot of distinction between God and science is, one, how would you, if you're someone that's like, I can see we can see in science how the Big Bang happened, and that was God breathed, and it began from God. It didn't just come from nothing. How would you begin to rectify, or how do you have that conversation with somebody that's very adamant that, hey, no, it's a 6-day creation, or that would say, the Bible is clear in this. Like, I'm sure you've had some of those conversations with people. Like, how do you rectify those and reconcile, like, we both have faith in the same God, and is it worth having that conversation for you, or what does that look like?
Yeah, so I think that I'd have to approach a conversation like that with a lot of humility, to just say that a college professor of mine once said, the universe, I don't know how old it is, but it sure looks old. So when we look at the universe scientifically and we see these layers in the Earth's crust, we see, the light of the stars reaching us after billions of years of travel, it really looks like we're in an old universe. But I'm humble enough to say I believe in a really powerful God. And so God could have created a universe that looks old. To me, that doesn't gel very well with how I see God, because I see God as someone who created us to discover and know the world around us. He put Adam in the garden to have dominion over it. And so when I do science, I see that as partnering in that work, that stewardship of the earth around us. So if God created a world that is deceptive, that looks older than it is, but he's also given us the ability to discover it and see how old it looks, it doesn't really seem loving to me. It doesn't really seem like something the God I worship would do. But I'm humble enough to say that it could be that way. He could have created fully formed humans that didn't evolve, even though it looks like they did.
Yeah. And so I think that's a posture that for you to take, but I think it's a lot of times difficult in the conversations I've had with people that are on the other end to hypothesize that God could have done it in an old earth. And I think it does take great humility to find, to figure this out, and to know ultimately, like, man, as much as we discover, like, God, if I could understand everything about God, he wouldn't be God anymore. He wouldn't be worthy of our worship. He wouldn't be any of that. And so I think it is one of those things that we want to, I think sometimes I've heard people say scientists try to play God, but I think a lot of times, even those who are opposed to science, we're trying to play God because we want to think we have all the knowledge wrapped up in our minds and that there's nothing else to be discovered. And so
none of us is immune to that, for sure. I think it's dangerous to, if we relegate God to the mysterious things, if we let science fill every space of human knowledge and say, well, anything that we can't explain, that must be God. We call that concept God of the gaps. And as our scientific knowledge expands, our space for God gets smaller and smaller. So I think it's really important to recognize that science and faith, they do cohere together, so that we don't shrink our understanding of God to just the things that we don't understand about the world around us. Yeah,
that's good. And I think we just fail to realize, as we live in 2020, how much we enjoy science every day. In the little, like, bottled water, even the ability in that process to have clean water in the United States, we don't ever have to think about, that comes out of our tap. All of that kind of stuff is contributed to science, but we don't ever think about it because we kind of get lost on what's the next thing, radiation, and is that evil, and 5G, and like all that kind of stuff, which we still have to test, but we want to throw the baby out with the bathwater without understanding. I rely on science every day when I drive, when I, take a shower, when I brush my teeth, like how much it's just a part of us. And so that's good. So how does your faith not just impact you as a scientist, but as you work in the medical? I mean, you've already mentioned, like, being able to kind of understand and follow Jesus' command as being a healer, and that's our job as Christians, is to bring hope and healing into the world. But how are there other ways that you would say your faith has impacted you in that community? Is it hard to live in that community as a Christian? Are you like the only one? What's that look like?
Yeah, so I guess one more thing I'd say about how my faith impacts the work that I do is just that it gives me a strong sense of purpose. I like the verse in Colossians that says, whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for human masters, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. So when I walk into the hospital, I try to remember that I'm not working for human masters. I'm doing God's work in that space. And so it helps, get through some of the harder days. We treat children sometimes who have cancer. We treat patients who have a really poor prognosis. And so it's sometimes hard to have hope when I see those people suffering, but I know that I'm doing, the work of the Lord when I walk in there. And so it really gives me, the motivation to keep going in there day after day. I would say that, in my current space, it's not difficult to be a person of faith. I'm usually pretty honest with people about my faith background. I think that, I'm a faculty member, so I'm also in academia. Sometimes being a Christian in academia can be a little bit difficult, especially in certain fields. In the sciences, you'd be surprised how many people would identify as Christian. But I think in some of the humanities fields, my husband works in philosophy. Sometimes that can be kind of a toxic environment for people of faith, especially because they do a lot of arguments, for and against God's existence. And so people feel like they've argued their way out of belief in God. So currently, it's not really that much of a struggle for me. I've been able to be pretty open about, my background, the fact that I go to church and things like that. But there are a lot of spaces in academia and other aspects of the sciences where it might be harder.
Yeah. Getting into like the faith and science and prayer, even kind of, this wasn't really on our agenda, but I'm wondering how you reconcile both. Like if you know that through radiation and medical advancements, we've come a long way. And I mean, even the ability to treat cancer, like when I was a kid, almost everyone that got a cancer prognosis died, and it was pretty quickly. And now I feel like I hear so many people with cancer that are surviving. Of course, it's still tragic. It's a tough disease, but how do you reconcile, if you get a prognosis or if somebody has a prognosis and there's not a guarantee, how do you reconcile like praying like that God would be a healer, in that kind of situation, which the scripture obviously invites us to do in a lot of places, and relying on science? Like how about that tension of like praying, man, that divine intervention could be a healing thing, a healing tool, or that medical intervention could be a healing tool, or both. Mm-hmm. So how do you rectify that, or what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, it's super important to talk about. So I think a story that comes to my mind is an example that a lot of people have heard, which is, there's a man sitting on his roof in a flood, and he's waiting for God to rescue him. And a raft comes by, and they're like, come on, get off the roof. We're here to save you. He's like, no, I'm waiting for God to rescue me. And then a boat comes by, and quick, get on the boat. We're here to rescue you. No, I'm waiting for God to save me. And then a helicopter comes by, and he rejects every opportunity, and he dies. He goes to heaven. He says, God, why didn't you save me from the flood? I was waiting for you to save me. And he says, well, I sent you a raft and a boat and a helicopter, and you kept saying no. So I think that, the medical tools that we've developed, that God has allowed us to develop, and given us the intellect to be able to do, they are ways that he works out that healing power in our lives. They're not the only way, but they are a way. So I think it's really important to, put our trust in the medical knowledge that we've developed as a species, but also to pray at the same time. God may heal you through your doctor's hands. He may heal you at home while you're sleeping through divine intervention, but if he hasn't told you he's going to heal you in that way, then I think we have to sort of operate in both worlds, that as we pray for things, that we don't know the mechanism by which he's going to answer that prayer. And the answer may be no, and it may be yes through your doctor, or it may be a different type of yes. And he may lead us through something totally unexpected, but we're always dealing with that tension, So I think it's really important to take the medical interventions, be careful about it too. Like, don't just take everything that someone tells you to, but also to pray and to trust God for that healing power.
Yeah, I remember, even a little over a year ago this time, we found out my daughter was deaf, and and I remember just living in that tension of like, man, I believe that this God, and I was like preaching through James. We were in a James series, which is literally where like, have the elders lay hands on you, put oil on you, anoint you, and pray that God would heal. And at the same time, like living in this tension of, I really, really believe God can. And if he chooses to, he will, but we're still going to go like seek the best care. And even the ethics around that, she ended up getting cochlear implants, and that's just fascinating. But literally like today, my daughter can hear, 30 years ago, that wasn't even a possibility. But for us living in that tension and like the ebbs and flows for me of like, man, the doubting the goodness and sovereignty of God in the middle of that. And are you listening? But yeah, you've provided this as a tool and an option. And so it's so hard to wrestle with that. And I think that's where we have community, other people to be asking those questions. It's where having these conversations are important, because sometimes people are like, you're only sick because sin in your life, and they get really wacky things, or they just refuse to see a doctor because they believe that's a lack of faith. And I think that, everyone Jesus healed died, right? So he healed them and he brought them healing, but ultimate healing is what we are longing for and believing for, that anyone who has placed their faith in Jesus, he will ultimately heal them, and there will be no more sickness and disease. But even healing that Jesus did was a temporal healing in our lives. And so I think that's important. I think for Christians that we wrestle through a lot. For me, that tension was so real as we wrestled through that. So, so now as we get into, and we've talked about this a little bit, but science and media, like we are living in a time where media access is everywhere. Social media, where everyone thinks every media has an agenda. We're in the middle of obviously a political season that is just wild. And so there are literal agendas, I think, that people do have and don't have. There's money that is to be made and lucrative businesses and all that kind of stuff inside of our world. How do we start to process? Help us figure out how we process this information. You did a little bit of masks, but how do we process? What do I really trust, and how do I trust in science and what I'm hearing in the media? What are good places to go to find not just someone's take on a scientific research paper, but to actually go figure that out and know what it actually says? Help me, please. I'm drowning.
So I think the first thing that's important is to seek consensus. So if you're looking for an answer that you're seeking an answer from the scientific community specifically, you want to see that lots of experts in that field have agreed on something. So if you read an article that's talking about a single scientific paper, the likelihood that that single scientific paper is telling you the whole picture is very low. Obviously with coronavirus, things are happening so fast that those single paper results may be important, but you have to hold them loosely in the sense that, our knowledge may change very rapidly. And part of the scientific method is that a result needs to be reproducible. So if someone else can't reproduce that same result in other populations that are more heterogeneous, meaning lots of different ages, lots of different ethnic backgrounds and things like that, then it's not a robust result. So when I say consensus, what I mean is, if you look at the epidemiology community as a whole, and 80% of them say that masks are helpful, and 20% of them say they aren't, the likelihood is that masks are helpful because we have consensus. Similarly, you could look at something like vaccines or climate change, where we have lots and lots of scientists telling us one thing and very few telling us the opposing view. And so for things that we have a longer history of scientific knowledge on, you can more easily see that consensus forming. And so as a lay person, I think it's really important to look for the experts, the people who are actually in that field. So a radiation oncologist probably shouldn't be telling you what to do about coronavirus generally. They may know some applications of it within their own field, but you need to be looking to the epidemiology community about disease transmission and things like that. So consensus is really important. And if the media sources you're going to aren't giving you that kind of broad perspective, then they may be misleading. The second thing I would say is that if you're getting your scientific information from the media, you have to recognize where the biases are. There's some good resources out there that kind of show or map out different media sources and what their bias tends to be. Do they tend to be left-leaning, right-leaning? Do they tend to be more opinion versus news? So if you're getting lots and lots of opinion, but not lots and lots of news, and that opinion is very biased, you're probably also not getting the whole story. So I would say it's good to pull data from multiple sources to look for consensus and to be aware of the biases that you see. Those are kind of some initial tips.
Yeah, is there a resource that you know of that would help us figure out those biases, or a good place to figure out some of this stuff off the top of your head?
Yeah, I can't remember what the website is called that I like, but I could probably link to it in your show notes after the conversation. But it gives kind of like a map of lots of different media sources with the biases that they have and whether they tend to be opinion versus news.
Cool.
And so that's something that I usually look for, just to be aware of the background of what I'm reading.
Cool. And maybe we can even mention it later when we talk about this. Another quick question. And I'm just thinking about this as a pastor. Do you ever get just frustrated with other scientists? Like, I mean, I think even all that stuff you're saying about consensus and all of this, like we could find pastors that have just said wacky things or have had wacky interpretations of what one passage says. And then people like cults start out of this. And there's like times I'm like, no, that's just wild and weird and crazy. And I just have to call it wild and weird and crazy and say, don't trust that. Like that same 80 to 20% rule, maybe. Are there times where you are like, yeah, there's just wacky scientists out there and some of them you shouldn't trust?
Absolutely. I mean, there's wacky people in almost any realm that you can find. So another piece of advice I'd have, when we talk about the media is don't get your information from memes. So you'll see all sorts of memes out there that claim to have some kind of scientific truth behind them, but there's no references. There's no source to it. And so the people that make those memes drive me nuts, but somebody had to make it,
Yeah.
So an example that I give is there was a meme that was floating around over the summer about coronavirus and masks. And it showed, one person wearing a mask who's sick, transmission is this percent. The person who's not sick wearing a mask, it's this percent. Both people wearing masks, it's this percent. And it seemed so confident. And I saw people with PhDs spreading this meme around. And it turns out it wasn't true. Those percentages were completely fabricated. And so just because someone's a scientist, just because they have a PhD or certification or something like that, doesn't mean that you should treat them like your cult leader or your guru. There's definitely going to be things that they'll get wrong too. And that's another reason that consensus is so important, is you kind of weed out some of that wacky behavior,
Yeah. So speaking of wacky behavior, you said you would never let your husband wear this wacky shirt. And I'd just like to hear, like you mentioned this earlier as we close, like you're married, like you are a physicist, you're married to a philosopher. Like what are conversations like in your house? Like how does that work? What are the tension points? Like share a little bit about what that looks like. Yeah. How did that even happen?
Well, we were both in grad school at the same time in Madison, and he was getting his PhD in philosophy. I was getting mine in medical physics, and we both joined the InterVarsity community. So we were in a Bible study together and kind of got to be friends in that environment, and then slowly developed feelings for each other. So it was definitely, a relationship built out of friendship, but for both of us, our careers were really important to us and our disciplines were really important to us. So conversations about, science and political issues and philosophy has always kind of been a big part of our home conversations. Sometimes we joke though, because when we got married, our minister said, imagine the pillow talk between these two, kind of saying like, oh, they must always have these elevated conversations. So whenever we talk about really stupid stuff, we're like, imagine the pillow talk between these two. So, we can still talk about really dumb things at the same time. But something that's been really special for me recently is that we've started collaborating together. So, just like science and faith can really cohere well, I think science and philosophy can come together as well. And so, he's an ethicist, so he studies ethics. And we wrote a paper last year about the ethics of physicists consulting directly with patients, which is something that's typically reserved for physicians and nurses and other patient-facing roles. And, sort of an ethical argument of why that might be a good thing for patients in their decision-making process. So that's been a really beautiful thing for me, is just to, see how his mind works at a deeper level and produce content together that's meaningful for our communities.
Yeah. How do you find unity? Like if there's something between both of you, you're like, I can't philosophically, I can't go there. You're like, he's like, scientifically, I just can't wrap my mind around it. Like, what are the things that you are like, okay, this isn't a hill we're going to die on. This is an impasse. Like, have you had some of those conversations where you're just like,
Absolutely. I've sort of learned the language of philosophers being married to him for 6 years. So I'll say things like, I'm sympathetic to that view, or, like you lean a certain direction or something like that. You can use gentler language as opposed to saying like, I am going to die on this hill.
Yeah.
Something that's interesting about us is that we lean to different sides of the political aisle. And so sometimes that can be kind of difficult, and we have uncomfortable conversations at home about politics. But my husband likes to say that he won't form a firm belief on something until we've talked about it together, because we kind of bring these different perspectives to it. And I think that's a great piece of advice for lots of listeners out there when you're talking about difficult discussions, whether it's science or religion or politics. Get lots of different opinions, have uncomfortable conversations, and bring in people you trust that you disagree with, and be humble in those conversations. And I think good things can come out of that.
Yeah, that's so good. So good. So many things that we can learn from this. So it's been a fun conversation for me to have, enlightening. I'll probably have to go back and listen through it just to fully get it all, but so many good things. So are there anything else that you're like, I need to talk about this? Like, people need to know this. They annoy me, and I want to say this as an expert, as a doctor.
I would just encourage listeners to, spend time gaining scientific understanding and cultivating that sense of awe about the world around us. Like, there are so many good pop science resources out there, people who try to communicate science at a lay level. And I think that it can be really fun and really beautiful and kind of take your mind off of the issues around the pandemic. And I think it's neat to be able to see how that gels with our faith in a powerful and creative God. So
yeah, so good. Well, Doctor, thank you for being here today. Thanks for sharing with our guests, and hopefully we'll have more of these conversations, or somebody feels enlightened by hearing this. And so we will talk to you later.
Sounds good. Thanks for having me.
All right, Alex, you got to sit down there with Megan, have a really fascinating conversation.
Yeah, that was really good.
Yeah, I was enjoying it a lot. She was just so well spoken about these really a lot of those issues are pretty pressing right now.
Yeah.
I was a little disappointed that you didn't press her a little harder about roller coaster people. Early on, you were asking about roller coaster people. I was on the edge of my seat.
Tell us.
It was good. I assumed that a physicist helps build.
And probably water slides then too.
I think those are engineers.
I know, but physics is definitely a part of a roller coaster going.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that's a huge part of roller coasters.
I can see how you got there.
Yeah.
I'll give you that.
It was just my own narrative I was writing in my head, as Alex just imagined all scientists were friends with roller coaster people. And so
it's just fascinating.
Anyways, it was really fascinating.
Ups and downs of that conversation.
And you handled it so well. And I think, like, I was trying to think, man, if I was interviewing her, I would have been so nervous that I would have used a word incorrectly.
Yeah, mispronounced something.
Yeah. But it was great. It was really great.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's fun to get to sit down and chat. Like I said beforehand, I would have given her this shirt to give to her husband if she would have let him wear it, but
I guess
unfortunately I get to save it. That's good news from the conversation.
Got outvoted on that one.
But it is fascinating because I think anyone in ministry, but anyone that's just even a Christian, there is always, how do I talk about this? I don't want to sound dumb when I'm talking about it. How do we, and just her humility that she approached it with, you don't always get to feel like, I think a lot of times, especially right now, people are just like scientists. They think they know everything. They think they have the final authority on everything. They're ruining the world, or not everybody, but there is, I think, a good chunk of people that are at that tension of faith and science have to be opposites. And so it was just good to hear some of her humility there, but also not shying away from what she's researched and studied, and how her calling as a Christian has shaped all of that.
I think that was good to hear too, because I feel like people think with science it's such a black and white thing, and for a scientist to just literally sit there and say, I'm just really humble with with anything because I don't know all the answers, and some of the things I'll never know the answers for. And I think it's kind of cool how that actually works along with like faith too. It's like we don't know all the answers about, you know, our own faith, and like there's some things we're not going to know until we get into heaven. And so I think it was kind of cool to see that come along side by side of like science and faith actually have a lot of similarities too, of just like we don't know everything and we just have to be really humble about that.
Yeah. And we don't know everything. So it can be intimidating or something that we don't even want to have a conversation about because it's like, I'm going to say the wrong thing or I don't know everything. But when she was talking about how part of loving God is loving him with your mind. And so maybe we're not scientists. I'm certainly not. But that was really challenging to me of like, okay, how am I loving God with my mind? Like, how am I doing research? How am I looking at science or learning about science? So I appreciated that. That was a good perspective.
I really liked hearing her explain how a lot of science is about consensus. And I think that's really valuable because especially whether it's been pandemic or whatever it might be, you see a lot of people going, oh, well, you know, my chiropractor told me this, or my doctor told me that, or this article I read told me this.
Or
meme. Yeah, or a meme, right. And it's like this stuff can be taken out of context. It can just be taken from one source, and there isn't a consensus on it. And so I think hearing that is just really valuable for people to realize that just because maybe one person had this study, it doesn't really prove everything until we get the same result from multiple sources.
Yeah, and like you were saying, Rachel, I was fascinated by the parallels between how she was talking about things and I'm talking about like studying scripture. I mean, most people probably don't even know, like, before a sermon is ever preached here on a Sunday morning, 10 days beforehand, we are getting together in a room with a lot of, you know, people that are on staff from different even theological bents, different ministry areas, and we're talking about this kind of stuff. We're trying to come up with consensus, and we ask these questions about, man, what does this mean? Is this am I going a little off the deep end with this this interpretation here? Should I say this? Should I not say it? And so even in that, we have, you know, this consensus, and there's also ministers that I talked about that drive me crazy, that I'm like, they're after money. They're after things that, you know, sometimes we point to scientists. It's just a money. Doctors are all about money. It's all about pharmaceutical and them taking over the world. But in every field, even in ministry, we have a lot of those parallels. And so that idea of consensus and making sure we have great community and we're not living on an island just sharing bad information, because I could do that with sketchy websites and preach a whole entire sermon on that and lead people astray as well. So
I also love how she talked about like science can actually benefit your faith or lead you to like a deeper awe of God. And I just remember in college, whenever I took a biology class, was my first experience of like learning about biology and like cells and just like every little detail that goes into those and thinking about how God created that. And that just grew my like awe for him and just like how big he really is and what he can do. And just how science actually can point back to God and really just like glorify him. And so I thought that was really cool that she brought that up as well, that's how she kind of views science too.
Right. Yeah, it was really great. You mentioned going back and like re-watching it just for information. I feel like I need to do the same. There was so much that I might have missed. She did mention an interactive media bias chart that you can find on a website. That website is adfontesmedia.com if you want to check that out. It looks like a great resource. I want to thank everybody for sitting down for this conversation. I want to thank Megan for, you know, kind of sharing her heart and her passion for science. It was really awesome. It's a great resource. I think people could benefit from sharing this with their friends and family. If you have any questions or concerns you'd like to reach out to us, you can do that on social media at CCC Omaha, or you can send us an email to podcast@cccomaha.org. We'd love to hear from you. Until next time, we'll talk to you then.